Great to see each one that is here today. To those that are visiting, you are honored guests. And what we mean when we say that is that if you need anything, you let us know and we'll do what we can to show you what they call Southern hospitality. We hope you enjoy the meals that are prepared. We hope that your accommodations are adequate. If you have problems, please let me know. I won't promise a solution, but I'll promise the best I can to offer you a solution. I wanted to speak now because I learned last year that when directing the lectureship, it's a very busy week. And I would almost just not speak at all, but I wasn't given that option. And so, because even this morning, I get busy greeting you and talking with you, dealing with other issues. We've already had one speaker conflict that we're working out and trying to deal with lectureship things that it's almost hard to come up here and to deliver a sermon. I appreciate those that have done this role for so long because there is a lot to it. And so I said, well, let me just kick it off. And we're going to talk about the importance of studying history, but I think it's important to talk about the series in which we are beginning this morning. Now, we're doing this not to take away from any other lectureship because there's a lot of good lectureships. And what I wanted to do is to stay off the topics they were already doing. And it started with kind of the idea of denominational doctrines. Because as I've preached at different congregations, people have always said, I want to learn more about this particular denomination, or I want to know where they all come from. And so this time last year, I was tossing around the idea we'd take a different denomination each year and examine their doctrines and have a resource for our denominational doctrines class. I went to the elders and I started to talk with them, and I believe it was Brother Lewis in particular that said, well, I want to know how it all fits into history. And I got to thinking about some things he said, and it kind of took a different direction. And as I went back to the drawing table, so to speak, and was working on this, the results is what you have before you. And it's really a 4-part series, and I'm going to just go ahead and throw this out there because we expect you to be here every year because you don't want to miss out. Now, the book is there. We want you to take it. We want you to use it. There's digital copies of this book, and download those from the website at your convenience. But we're going to be using this book in our church history classes. And so we'll have a basis to go off in our courses. And this first year, we're dealing with up to 1500, 1501. And I've learned there's not exact years to cut these dates off. And so I'm kind of picking what looks good on a book cover to some degree, because if I pick some random year, people start, why that year? So 1501, we're going to pick up next year. And we're going to deal with the Reformation movement. Then the third year deal with the Restoration movement. And the fourth year will begin roughly around 1900, noticing more recent movements and their effect upon religion. And in particular, in all these lessons, what we hope is how do they affect the one true church? How does it affect us as Christians? Now, the first time I have 2 responses that I get from this. One is, oh, wow, that's interesting. The other response I get is, why are you doing that? And I realize it's somewhat different. But history, it's important to study. Now, if you want to define what history is, we can go to, and this is in your book, the definitions from Webster. It's what has happened in the life or development of a people, country, institution. It's a systematic account of this, usually in chronological order, with an analyst and explanation. The 5th meaning, if you look to it in Webster's dictionary, it says the branch of knowledge that deals systematically with the past. A recording, analyzing, correlating, and explaining of past events. And if we come in here in these lectures and all we do as speakers is stand up here and start giving you facts and to say stuff like Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, I want to say in 1492. I haven't studied that in a while. That'll start to get boring. I get that. And we start thinking of memorizing lists. And used to in school, you had to learn a list of the presidents of the United States. Or you might have to learn a bunch of dates of all these different wars. And brethren, I will tell you, that is boring to me. And I don't like that, but that's not what this is about. A true, rewarding, profitable study of history is one that is not merely a mental retention of facts and figures, but it should lead to an understanding from proper analyzation and correlation. The things that we are going to be studying apply to us today, even though they happened so many years ago. But somebody says, well, that's going to be boring. Well, one, to our speakers in here, if it's boring, it's because of you. If I bore you this morning, it's because of me. I get that. And we're going to try, and I have great confidence in every speaker on the program that they are capable and will make it interesting. They will make it applicable because they're not up here just to give you facts. And they will preach it in love. Because in some of this, we are going to tread delicately into some areas that may be sensitive for some. But when you deal with the historical approach, it's a whole lot better to get down to the facts and to see what is truth. And so we will study things this week like Roman Catholicism, Nestorianism, Oriental Orthodox, Greek Orthodox. When we get on Montanism and Marcionism, brethren, I want you to pay close attention, because when we study that from a historical point of view, I want you to understand that those are some doctrines that we are facing today among liberal brethren. There's nothing new under the sun. Now, some people say, well, boredom. You realize television is based off of history so much of the time? Hatfield and McCoy's. I've watched that twice now. Now, if I refer to a TV or movie show, don't use your discretion on what you watch. Don't have a television. I don't care. You do what you need to do to be able to stay holy and to avoid evil influence. But I watched that thing, and I learned a lot about the Hatfield McCoys. And then I started wondering, I wonder how much of this is true. And all of a sudden, I started reading about it. History program had one called The Men Who Built America. If you haven't seen that, I highly recommend it. And there's lessons I learned all along the way about greed, about American industry and economics. And brethren, they're spending millions of dollars producing this. Now, would they do that if it was just boring? It's not boring. Other people don't want to study history, though, because they don't want to see the truth. Because when you truly start studying history, everything in it is not always pretty and tidy and wrapped up in a nice little package. I love The Greatest Generation. Tom Brokaw, don't necessarily endorse everything about him, but he wrote regarding The Greatest Generation. He described them as saying they answered the call to help save the world from the two most powerful and ruthless military machines ever assembled. Instruments of conquest in the hands of fascist maniacs. They faced great odds at a late start, but they did not protest. At a time in their lives when their days and nights should have been filled with innocent adventure, love, and the lessons of the workday world. They were fighting hand to hand in the most primitive conditions possible across the bloodied landscape of France, Belgium, Italy, and Austria. We think about that generation. And I start thinking about how, as a nation, we pulled together. If you haven't been and you're able to work it in, at times the lectures aren't going on. You go to the Navy Museum. You go to that area that focuses on the World War II era. And it's really neat to me, and one of my favorite parts of that whole museum is going into what simulates a little town of that time. And you can go in there and you can see what you had to do to buy groceries. There's a video, and I didn't realize this, bacon grease. I've saved bacon grease. Mama taught me that. Because it makes your green beans taste wonderful. But people would forego using their bacon grease and would save it to make sure that explosives could be made with it for our military guys. Back home, people were doing without meat and meals to make sure our military had food. man, if we could only get people to have the mindset of giving and unity that they had in that generation. But see, if you study that generation, you go to the other side of it. You also have to study what was being done in the Nazi concentration camps. And you have to suddenly start realizing that 7 and 9 million people had been uprooted from their homes by the Nazis. And it's easy for us to point over there, brethren, but if you study that right here in the United States after the Pearl Harbor bombing attack, we created our own camps as Americans. And we rounded up Americans that came and had their citizenship. And just because they were from another country, we incarcerated them. See, studying history sometimes makes you face some ugly truths. This week, we will see some ugly truths. Because when we start, as Brother Burleson is going to in the worship hour, when we start and we see this beautiful, harmonious Word of God, we see Christ and His glorious bride. And we see unity as it starts out in Acts chapter 2. And we see growth in that Lord's church. But very quickly, as Brother Bates is going to see, even in the New Testament, we start seeing departures. We start seeing the division that plagued the church. And then as we go forward and we have the ecumenical councils considered, we start seeing where sometimes laws are changed. We start seeing the division that's coming forth. We start seeing, as we go into this, where denominationalism is formed, and that's not what God desires for His church. And there's a point that these people professing Christianity are no longer the church. I think about the words of Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He said, the sheer awfulness of atrocity makes us to wish it away. And brethren, in history, there's some sad moments in our time. But let me tell you, we can take away monuments. We can take away stuff out of textbooks. We can try and remove it and ban things from going upon television or to go into print. But that doesn't change the truth that these things happened. And if we want to avoid the problems and the conflicts that made those marks that are considered to not be good in our history, then we need to be studying them. And we need to study them from every angle so that we can avoid it in the future. Isn't that what God always expected from us? Let's think about this. And there is a godly expectation of man to study and remember history. In the Old Testament, God would set orders to remember. Think about it in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 through 11. We have the case in which the Sabbath is being commanded to be observed. He says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them. That in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Major part of Old Testament law. Major command that is being given here is that you remember the Sabbath, you keep it holy. And why? Because they need a day of rest. No. Oh, there's benefits of it. A day of rest is a good thing. It's nice when we can work one in, but that's not why He gave it to them. He gives the explanation because in 6 days God made this world. On the seventh He rested. And He says, you remember this. Think about the Passover. Passover, there's beautiful New Testament imagery that we have of Jesus with His disciples observing and keeping the Passover feast. And we think about it, and we could spend great time talking about each aspect of the Passover, but we won't do so this morning. But why did they keep the Passover? Because they needed a meal? I like a meal. We ate fish last night. That's good. Lamb, I'm not very keen on, by the way. Went down to Rodizio's. It's a little fatty. But, any meal, y'all. If you want to cook lamb, I'll come and eat with you. I eat anything. Is that why they did it? No. If you look to Numbers chapter 9, verse 1 through 5, we actually have where it was being instituted, and the reasoning being because, see, the Israelites were in Egyptian bondage. And that final plague was going to come. And they were to remember about what happened because, brethren, the firstborn had died in every house of Egypt except the Israelites when they had taken the blood and had smeared it from the lamb across the doorpost. And as death would come, it passed over the Israelites. And notice Moses, he didn't have to go and ask. Pharaoh sent for Moses and commanded them, you get out of my country. And what was to follow would be a great scene to behold. Because the Israelites would flee. He changes his mind. Pharaoh sends the army after them. Oh no, what are we going to do? They go forth, and here's the Red Sea. And God causes a mighty wind to part it. They walk through on dry ground. When the army pursues after them, the walls of water come down, and God has delivered them. And the women begin to sing the song of Moses. Why were they to partake of the Passover over and over and over again? To remember. Because God has an expectation you learn from history. In Deuteronomy chapter 9 and verse 7. Deuteronomy chapter 9 and verse 7. He tells them, remember and forget not how thou provokest the Lord thy God to wrath in the wilderness from the day that thou didst depart out of the land of Egypt until you came unto this place. You have been rebellious against the Lord. See, this goes back to that idea. We don't like to remember everything, do we? Y'all, I was the best son and kid my parents could ever have. I don't know what happened to my sister. I kept my room clean. I did everything right. That's if I choose just to remember those things. But y'all, when I remember the things and when I was rebellious, there's a few things that happen. One, it humbles me. Two, it makes me appreciate my parents all that much more. And God tells them, you remember how from the time I brought you out of Egypt you behaved. A command to remember. He tells them in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 15, thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee. Therefore I command thee this thing today. He's reminding them of the price that was paid. He's telling them, you remember how you got here. Now, we as parents know the importance of history, right? Don't some of you mothers remind your children? I carried you for 9 months. You realize what I have done for you? What are you doing? You're saying, look at the history. And you use it in your argumentation with your children. The New Testament, Romans chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. That's the passage that, you hear this sermon, you think, okay, we're going to go there as our base of our text. And you can't overlook it. Because certainly for those that would say we need to dismiss the Old Testament and stick in the New Testament, this is where we'd go. Because Paul's writing to the church at Rome. He tells them beginning in verse 1. We then that are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let every one of us please his neighbor for his good edification. For even Christ pleased not himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of them that reproach thee fell on me. For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. Now the God of patience and consolation grant you to be like-minded one toward another according to Christ Jesus, that you be with one mind and one mouth, glorify God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now I want you to notice something. And I quote that verse a lot. The things written aforetime were written for our learning. And we say, see, we need the Old Testament. But brother, I want you to look at the context. He puts that right in the middle of a section that he's talking about how we treat one another. He wasn't trying to tell them why you need to study the prophets. He wasn't trying to tell them why they need to study the old law. He's saying you need to understand this principle of what I'm teaching you is from the beginning. Jesus, whenever they came to him, questioning about Moses putting away a written form of divorcement, what did Jesus tell them? From the beginning it was not so. And if you want to know the design of marriage, brethren, you need to study history. Because you go back and in history you can see exactly what God intends. He intends one man, one woman for life. That's what he's designed it for. And when you study history, you're going to see what messes up when you start adding a plurality of wives to that. Because when you go to Abraham, and all of a sudden you see Sarah and Hagar, and you have a child being born to one man and multiple women, there's a problem there. Because there's a thing called jealousy. Brethren, I don't have to experiment and find out that I only need one good woman in my life after my mother to bring me into this world. Because I look through history every time it happens, what's the result? It's not good. You name the subject matter, we're being told in the New Testament, you remember this. Even in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1 through 15, they are told to remember about what happened in Egypt. What about on this table? I think ours says it too. This do in remembrance of me. And this morning we'll have our worship service and we will partake of the Lord's Supper the same way as we do every first day of the week. And why do we do that? Because we like grape juice? Because we like that unleavened Maz toast wafer? No. Because we are remembering and observing the sacrifice that Jesus paid for us. But what's the significance of that sacrifice, by the way, if we don't go back to Genesis chapter 12 and understand the promise made to Abraham? Or maybe we go back to Genesis chapter 3 and we see the punishment being doled out, and it talks about that the seed of the woman shall bruise the head of the seed of Satan. You realize how much we miss out on if we don't take the time to learn just a little bit of history? Think about Hebrews. You know, I was talking to the guys about length of sermons. I told them, eventually it gets to a point you don't worry about how long a sermon is. It's just how am I going to fit it in? Because I could take the time this morning and start going through the book of Hebrews chapter 11 and we could spend the rest of the time right there. And we couldn't even make it all the way through. But we think about this chapter, and in particular, we think about how it relates to us and the concept of salvation. And it's quoted quite often in verse 6. But without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Now, how does the writer of Hebrews explain this? How does he get this point through to those in whom he's writing? See, you go to verse 7, by faith, Noah. Now, if you don't study about Noah, that doesn't mean a whole lot to you, does it? Because you might think, hey, he went and built a little boat. I know a lot of people build a little boat. Study history. There's not a lot of people that build a 300 cubit by 50 cubit by 30 cubit boat in a time that they didn't have power tools. Make it all out of gopher wood. They didn't have a Home Depot to go buy it. And suddenly, when it says by faith Noah, and you study a little history, suddenly you sit there and say, hey, there's something to this faith. And then you go down a little further and it says by faith Abraham. Go a little further, it says by faith Sarah. By faith Rahab. By faith, and it's all these people. And if you just study this and you don't study the history of it, what's it mean? He's using this to make his points. So why? Why do we need to remember? Because, brethren, history has a tendency to repeat itself. See, take Abraham. It can happen in the life of an individual. I would love to say, they always say shame on, shame me once, shame on me, shame me twice, or shame on you, shame me twice, shame on me, something like that. I don't like cliche sayings, so I don't keep up with them well. But I hate it when I make the same mistake twice. I would like to tell you I don't do that. And I'm sure you think I'm perfect, but I'm not. But it happens. And you think about it and you think, well, if you ever run out of gas once, it won't happen twice. You ever think that, if I lock myself out, I won't do that again. And you think, well, you can learn from history. You make a mistake one time, you won't do it twice. But I know if I start going around this room, everybody's got something in here that they made a mistake twice. Same was true with Abraham, wasn't it? You have the case in Genesis chapter 12, verse 13. He presents his wife as his sister. I don't have time to go into all that, but brethren, God did not approve of this. So you think, well, hey, he'll learn his lesson, right? Go to chapter 20 and verse 2. He does it again. He should have paid attention to history. He should have known this wasn't the right action, but he did it again. There's some other example in your book that I'm going to forego in this lesson this morning, but I encourage you to go there and study that later. A lot of times it's in generations too. You think about Isaac. How many times do you think he was told the story? Generations like to tell stories to other generations. We are a storytelling people, aren't we not? This week, how many stories are going to be told around these tables and at breaks? We like to tell stories. You think, well, at least that presenting your wife as your sister thing, it would have stopped after 2 times, and certainly the child wouldn't have done so. Well, if you go to chapter 26, verse 6 through 9, you actually have Isaac representing his wife, Rebekah, to the men in Gerar and King Abimelech. But see, it tends to happen over the ages. Think about the book of Judges. I love teaching the book of Judges, one of my favorite books. But then I say the same thing about other books of the Bible, so I don't know. But the book of Judges, you have a cycle, 40 years. You have a generation come and they follow after God, but then they start to depart from God. Then the persecution comes. And then when the persecution comes, they get tired of the persecution, so they turn back to God. God sends a deliverer, a judge, and he delivers them from the persecution. And so then they're faithful for a little while, but then it comes again and they depart from God. And so whenever they depart from God again, he allows the persecution to come, and then all of a sudden they get tired of the persecution, then they turn back to God, deliverance, and God sends them once again the deliverer, the judge, to deliver them out. And then they'll be faithful for a little while. Each time, though, there's an interesting phrase. It says that these were worse than the generation before them. Wouldn't you like to think that we wouldn't make the same mistakes over and over again, generation after generation, time after time? I would like to think that, but that's not the case. If anything, we often let it get worse and worse and worse. That's what the whole book of Judges was about. Think about some other matters that we see this. What about the problems of fermented alcohol and the consumption thereof? We have the case of Noah. We have a case in which he is seen, and I can't imagine being Noah to have witnessed the destruction that he had. I can't imagine being on that ark with all those animals for the amount of time he was. But he gets off, he plants a vineyard, it takes some time, obviously, it grows, and he allows the fermentation, and he commits the sin of drunkenness. To the point his sons have to come in and cover his nakedness and care for him the way you would a child. Well, I'm glad he's the only one in history ever had that problem, right? What about Lot? Becomes so drunk with wine that he does not either one know or care. Some debate there, but either case be, he conceives a child with one daughter, and the next night, in the same method, happens again with the other daughter. 2 times. I'm glad we've learned our lesson. Nabal refused to help David and his servants. Right there in 1 Samuel chapter 25, here comes David and the men. And so Nabal, he's sitting there ready to defend his house and his honor. Nope. He's off drunk and has to count on his wife to do the prudent thing to settle the matter because he has left himself defenseless. King Elah, drinking himself drunk to the point that he was defenseless when Zimri came to attack him. Well, at least in 2018, we have finally figured it out. Every day, I got to read this statistic. Every day, almost 29 people in the United States die in alcohol-impaired vehicle crashes. That means in 2016, and it's actually the numbers are worse today, that one person every 50 minutes is dying because of alcohol-impaired deaths. That means before we eat lunch today, at least 2 people will die. Before the end of this lectureship, every single day, more than 24 people will die. Because we can't seem to learn from history. And we could talk about why drunkenness is wrong and about the problems of social drinking and how it is wrong. But brethren, I don't even need those arguments to know that I don't need to be drinking fermented drinks. Let's take some lessons very quickly in the closing moment that we can learn from this time period. And I think there's going to be a lot of them. I told you, I have complete confidence in our speakers. And when I told them, I said, I need you to make a lesson that you cannot possibly preach everything. Because we need that for a book. But when you preach it, you don't have to preach everything that's in there. I don't want a man standing up here and just reading you a list of every pope that's ever been appointed to that position by a worldly institution. That would get boring, wouldn't it? But we need to be equipped. So what are some things we can learn? In his book, History of Christianity in the Middle Ages, from the fall of Rome to the fall of Constantinople, Cannon wrote, Christianity in the Middle Ages has been a concern of too few among English-speaking Protestant church historians. I certainly do not place the true church in Protestantism. I place it as the true church in Christianity. But I will say that statement rings true today. You start talking to your average Bible student, Christian, preacher, deacon, or elder, this time period is tough. Somebody in Georgia, I was over there, and they were coming up talking to me about our lectureship schedules, and they said, congratulations for having the lectureship with the hardest topics ever. Okay. I'm looking forward to this, guys, because I need to learn some more of this history. And I can't go and do all the research myself and get my work done, so I'm looking forward to this week. And then he sat there and he told me, he said, you also win the prize for the only lectureship that that preachers sit there saying, please don't call me, please don't ask me. We're not as familiar with this period of history, so why are we studying it? Why don't jump over to the Reformation? Why don't we jump to the Restoration? That's what we like. Why don't we just study that? Because there's some things that took place from 33 to 1500 that have a bearing in 2018. In Roman Catholicism, it continues to have a great bearing upon this world. And within it, they came along and they started mandating celibacy. And brethren, that affects to this day. I didn't know this as a child. I was not affected by this as a child. I want to clarify this. But I knew suddenly Father Dan there in southern Illinois that helped out with the Boy Scouts and all that. Suddenly he was gone. Later my parents were asking me, said, Has Father Dan ever done anything? Has Father Dan ever, and I'm using that accommodatively, y'all. He ain't my father. And I was like, no. When I got older, I figured out he didn't move on his own, and it wasn't just time to move. But there was a problem with pedophilia. And if you look in the book, there's tons of, or several different references that are in that book telling you and explaining to you about the effect on this, that of the millions upon millions of lives that are being affected. Because they changed God's word. Because in 1 Corinthians 7, God clearly inspired that before a man is to burn in his lust, he better get himself a wife. But yet you have a religious organization decide to change that. Whenever you think about history and you study about the Muslims, brethren, if you will listen to what Ronnie's going to preach to you, if you will listen to these presentations that Jason and David will deliver to you, they talk about Muslims and the effect of Islam upon society. And if you look in history in this time period, civilizations that were tolerant of that religion paid the ultimate price. It is not a religion of peace that people want to pretend it is. They are not tolerant of others. And Christianity, Roman Catholicism, and the Muslims and Judaism have never coexisted in peace, and it will not start today. But how many times do you turn the news on and that's what they're trying to tell us? And you think about our government today and the policies that they're making, I wish they would be here and listen to these lessons, because if you would listen to this lectureship this week and you will study some history, you will see the absurdity of which our lawmakers reason things, thinking that somehow they're going to bring peace to the Middle East. Study your history, brethren. Study the Bible. You're going to see that's not going to happen. The importance of studying history, brethren, it's not boring. If we're looking at it, we can keep from making the same mistakes. And let me tell you something. We have been in the period of restoration, and this is what I'll leave you with in closing, is that we have been in the period of restoration movement. But those that have affiliated themselves with the true church, much of the departures I read about during my study of this time period we're seeing happen in the church today. That's why we need to study history, so we don't go in the paths away from God, but to always turn back to Him. Thank you for your attention.